I'm saying that data can be utilised. It can be not sold because there's GDPR regulations in the EU and issues like that, but it could certainly be beneficial for other partners.
Hello, welcome to another guest segment on Africa Business Radio. I am Nonso Mordi. With an announcement imminent over who will be officially bidding to host Euro 2028, could the UK and Ireland be in contention to win their bid, and what impact could both bidding for and potentially hosting Europe's biggest football competition have on the chosen nations? Now, Dr. Tom Bason from Coventry University's Research Centre for Business and Society has carried out PhD research into bidding for major international sporting competitions and the societal and economic impacts of hosting them. He is also an Associate Research Centre for Business and Society and Assistant Professor in Sport Management, Course Director for BA Sport Management, BA Event Management, BA Sport Marketing, and BA International Event and Hospitality Management. He is here today to give us his expert insight on this topic. Welcome, Dr. Tom. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Okay. You wear so many caps, Dr. Tom. How is that like?
It's fun. You will notice that it's all sport related.
Yes, true.
I wouldn't do it all if it wasn't sport.
So which is your favourite sport?
Football, primarily.
What's your team?
I think I'm a Wolverhampton Wanderers. I'm a Wolves fan.
That's nice.
That's nice. That's a typical response when I say I'm a Wolves fan.
Okay, well, which other team do you support, if not that one?
Wolves and only Wolves. There's only one football team that I care about.
Oh, wow. I see that you just won. You don't waver at all. That's nice.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so let's talk about sports, how it has evolved, especially the finance aspect.
Yeah, so it's developed an awful lot over the last decade or so. It's certainly evolved if we go back through the history of sport, in that it has become a lot more business focused. It was easy for sports to be focused on sport when it was owned by people who cared about that. But as we've seen so much over the last few decades, that there's been so much outside investment, whether that's owners of sports clubs, whether it's we've seen equity buy-ins for things like in New Zealand, the All Blacks, and these companies aren't buying into sport because they love sport. There may be an element of CSR to some of it, but a lot of it is because they want a return on that investment. And so what we've seen more and more is that revenue is become more important. The difficulty is that, especially in professional sports, especially here in the UK, that what we've seen is that as soon as companies get more money coming in, they spend it. So every time there's a new TV deal in the Premier League and the amount of revenue that clubs earn goes up, so do player wages, so do transfer fees. And so this is then very much the difficulty, and it almost seems a slight contradiction that we have all these owners who have made a fortune in the private world and then come into sport and can't seem to operate on the same way. For example, Everton at the moment, who are owned by Farhad Moshiri, a very, very successful businessman who's applied millions, hundreds of millions into the club, and yet they're in the worst position they've been for an awful long time. Financial issues off the pitch, sporting issues on the pitch, and so all that investment, all that knowledge that's come into the club from outside hasn't helped it at all.
So you're saying that there could be more money coming in if this business is actually not squander the money but use it for something beneficial.
Yeah, I think there's been So largely, as soon as the money comes in, it gets spent. We see that when teams get promoted into the Premier League, that they get promoted, they earn £100 million more in revenues in the Premier League than they would have done the previous season in the Championship. But they don't end the year with £100 million of profit. They end the year probably in more debt than they were at the start. So even though they're earning probably 5 times more revenue in the next financial year, their expenses go up significantly as well.
Okay.
This is certainly the case in UK sport, top level sport. It's amplified in football, certainly top level and in the Championship. But then we also see it in other sports, in the UK professional sports, in rugby union, in cricket, where it's not quite at the same levels. They're not earning hundreds of millions, but we still have organisations who are losing significant amounts of money on a yearly basis.
Okay. Now, speaking of this point you just mentioned, what basic financial concept do you feel are important to sport finance that these businesses have not yet recognised?
I think that's something that sports clubs haven't particularly utilised well, but could be used for greater revenue generation, is sheer amount of data that they have. They have exceptional data on their fans, that there are each football club in the up and down the leagues, even smaller clubs, will have exact data on hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people who are registered with them, and they will know what time these fans arrive in the stadium, what they spend money on, where they live. That they have huge amounts of data, and we're kind of starting to see that come in at the moment with other companies looking to partner with them. But I certainly think that's something that hasn't been used on a wide spread level, and that's something that the sports clubs could take advantage of. We've seen outside sport in recent years with Google and Facebook the value that having data on your customers has, and sports clubs perhaps not in the same amount, but they have a huge amount of data on their fans that should be invaluable.
Okay, so having a huge data will, push things further for them. That's what you're saying.
I'm saying that data can be utilised. It can be not sold because there's GDPR regulations in the EU and issues like that, but it could certainly be beneficial for other partners.
Okay, all right. Now let's talk about this bidding to host, the Euro 2028. Now, I'm curious, why are countries like the UK and Ireland, bidding for this? Everybody is like, most of them want to host this Euro 2028. Of what importance is it?
That's a good question, and there's lots and lots of reasons why they might want to bid for it. So England, I think that. So if you don't know the background, England and the rest of the UK were looking at bidding for the 2030 FIFA World Cup.
Okay.
Ireland then joined that potential bid, but then I think we kind of got feedback from UEFA that if we were to bid for it, we wouldn't have the support of the other UEFA countries, that they would be supporting a bid from Spain and Portugal. And if we don't have the support of the UEFA countries, that then makes it incredibly difficult to then go out and get the support from all the other continents. Straight away, we'd be behind Spain and Portugal. So that meant that the bid for the 2030 World Cup was a bit of a non-starter. And then it's since then that we've decided to bid for Euro 2028. It's interesting because there's essentially different nations in this joint bid, each of whom will have different reasons for wanting to bid. So England, for example, we've bid twice for World Cups previously. We bid for the 2006 World Cup and the 2018 World Cup, and lost heavily in both. It was relatively quite embarrassing. I think we got 2 votes for 2018, and that was it. And I think the English Football Association possibly look that for a country with the football heritage that England has and the global dominance that the Premier League has, for us not to have hosted a tournament since 1996, when you've got lots of other countries who have hosted these tournaments in that time, perhaps it could be a case of thinking we should be hosting these things, that if nothing else other than to build our position in the footballing world. We also have an issue potentially here in the UK in that over the last 5 years or so, it is becoming more and more estranged with the rest of Europe. And this could be a way from a global politics point of view to try and rebuild that a little bit. And then the other countries, Scotland, Ireland, Wales and Northern Ireland, will have their own reasons. Scotland and Ireland were looking at bidding, and Wales, they've looked at bidding previously for Euros, but I think are relatively unlikely to be able to host without the support of England, just because they don't have the experience of hosting such events in the past. And so it's an opportunity for them to host an event. Scotland hosted some of the games in Euro 2020 last summer. Ireland was supposed to host some of those games, but didn't ultimately because of their COVID restrictions. But it's an opportunity for them to host a tournament in a way that they haven't before. We've seen Scotland in particular hosted the Commonwealth Games in 2016. It's co-hosted the World European Games a couple of years ago. These hosting sports events is always a nice thing for a country. It can bring a little bit of attention that it perhaps wouldn't necessarily get.
Okay, so what is the impact? I know you've spoken about attention, but then is there any other impact on probably the economy when they host things like this, like the Euro 2028?
So the theory is that you host these events, and during the event itself, it brings in a load of tourists who spend money. They book hotels, they go out and they eat and drink, and they go into different sightseeing places in the city, and it brings money to the region that way. That certainly does happen, especially if you're hosting events that see people travel. If England are hosting a game at Wembley, I don't know how many outside people it will bring to Wembley, or whether it would just be people who live in London anyway. How many people who attend an England game are staying in a hotel the night before? Probably not many. But if, for example, you have, Sweden against France playing at Wembley, and you have a lot of Swedish and French football fans who then probably will stay in a hotel the night before, the night after, and they go out and they spend money. So the theory is it brings in tourism revenue in the short term. In the longer term, in theory, that raising a profile, that international image, can be a way to trade with other countries. It can be a way to position yourself on the international stage. It can also be a way to bring in future tourists. South Africa in 2010 certainly sought to use the World Cup then to position itself as a tourism destination. And for a country like South Africa, hosting the World Cup was a fantastic opportunity, that's an opportunity to showcase itself on the international stage that it probably wouldn't have had without that. The reality is that it can be very, very difficult. There's, especially in the short term, there's not a huge amount of evidence that it brings massive economic boosts. Partly because you bring some fans in, yes, but like I said, if England are playing at Wembley and people travel to Wembley, are they spending money they would have spent anyway? Is it bringing any new money into the region? When we hosted London 2012, there's evidence that shows that hotels and restaurants actually did worse during that period because people were actively staying away from London because they thought it'd be busy, they thought it'd be expensive. So people who may have travelled to London during that 3-week period we hosted the Olympics didn't. The people actually left London because the Olympics was taking place because they thought it would be so busy, so expensive. So the economic impacts are always very, very questionable in pretty much any event that's ever happened. What it does hosting these events is potentially you build infrastructure that obviously South Africa did during the 2010 World Cup, built stadiums, built transport networks. These are, and what it can do is open up routes of funding that they don't necessarily have access to otherwise.
Okay.
If you're a city and perhaps you need an investment in transport, in your public transport networks, and you don't have the money, and you're hosting a sports event, perhaps you can go to your national government and say, we need this in order to host the event. If we don't, we're not going to be able to host, and that's going to be really embarrassing. And so then the national government gives money. The issue with these things is when you build facilities that are only needed for the event itself. Public transport networks, fantastic, because they're often things that you need that will be beneficial for the event itself, but then can be utilised in the years after the event takes place. The building of sports stadiums is slightly more problematic. I've been to football in Cape Town, at Cape Town Stadium, where in a 60,000 seater stadium, there were 400 fans in there. We saw similar in terms of the Euros in Portugal. Portugal built 9 new stadiums for Euro 2004. And now there are lots of teams in Portugal who have stadiums with capacities that they can't fill. They don't need those stadiums. So infrastructure investments can be incredibly useful if it's things that the region already need.
Okay.
If the investment builds into the ongoing strategy of the city. If you're building things that are just for the event, it's problematic. I mean, even here in the UK, when we built the Olympic Stadium, we didn't know what was going to happen to the Olympic Stadium until after the Olympics had taken place.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up going to, being rented by West Ham for a relatively small amount of money because that we built a stadium for a 3-week event that we didn't particularly need afterwards. And so the infrastructural legacy is always an issue. And then that then brings with it a second the biggest negative legacy probably of hosting these events is that if you build infrastructure, quite often it's in places that need development. And the issue with that is that the people in areas that need development, they're quite often places where low-income people live. And so they get displaced, they get kicked out of their houses, you get houses knocked down. Pretty much every Olympics that's ever taken place, you get homeless people kicked off the streets because these regions are being built in. And even if they're not being kicked out of their houses, then you invest in an area, that area becomes more wealthy, and it then becomes incredibly difficult for the people who were living there previously because they didn't have a huge amount of money to still live in that area. And this happens whether you're a low-income country, a developing country in the first place, or whether you're a more well-developed country. It's happened in Olympics in London, it's happened in Olympics in the USA, where they build infrastructure in places that need investments, but then this prices out the people who live there in the first place. And the major criticism we've seen of these sorts of events over the last decade or so have been these human rights issues. In this discussions going on about LA at the moment, in Brazil, both for the World Cup and for the Rio Olympics, discussions about it in London. What I'm hoping for Euro 2028, if we host it here, is that we don't need a huge amount of infrastructural development, that will use already existing stadiums, that there are stadiums that are big enough in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, in Dublin, in Cardiff, and then in plenty of cities around England where we have Premier League football, they already have transport networks, so there shouldn't need to be a huge amount of infrastructural development here. In terms of sporting legacies, this is the other thing that's always spoken about, that if you host an event, it will lead to people playing sports. That for London 2012 here in the UK had the tagline of "Inspire a Generation." And again, there's not a huge amount of evidence that this ever really happens. There's always kind of an assumption that if people watch people playing sports on TV, that will then inspire them to go out and try it themselves, when it doesn't really work that way. There's already sports on TV. If you're not inspired beforehand, the fact that you're hosting the event probably isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. And so I think it probably could work, but what it needs is for plans to be in place. It needs to capture the energy and the interest that's happened during the event and in the year or two build up to the event. And then you can start to get people to play sport, but not if you just assume it's going to happen anyway. With all these legacies, and whenever people talk about legacies from events, if they're just assumed it will happen, positive legacies don't happen, negative legacies do. There needs to be a strategic plan from now. Basically, the strategic plan should have been in place from last year, really going right the way through to 2028, working out what's going to happen, how we're going to harness the interest, the excitement, the energy in the build up to the event, to make sure that everything we need is in place long before the event takes place, and then that there are strategies for what's going to happen afterwards. The difficulty is that the people who manage these events focus on managing the event because that's the job, and managing these events is very, very difficult. And so their focus is on making sure, are we ready for the opening game? Do we have stadiums that are going to be able to host? Are all the volunteers in place? And then it's so easy to forget about what happens after the tournaments, after the Euros, after the World Cup, and what the impact is going to be over the next 5-10 years.
Actually, with what you said, there's a whole lot that goes into, just hosting. And I agree that it's not just about hosting the event, it's what happens after as well, the legacies that you leave behind. Now, on that note, what goes into this bid process? What criteria do they use for selecting the successful nations?
So the bid process is starting at the moment. So last month, by the 23rd of March, football associations had to say whether they had to express their interest in hosting. So we had the football associations of England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales did jointly. There was the Football Association of Turkey, said they were going to bid for 2028. The Football Association of Russia said they're going to bid for 2028 and 2032. And Italy expressed interest in 2032. They're due to announce the bidders anytime soon. The initial timeline said they were going to be announced earlier this week, but as far as I'm aware, that hasn't actually happened yet. And then the bid process goes through until next April, until April 2023, when they need to submit their bid documents. And during that time, the different bid cities will be putting together their plans. They will be looking at which stadiums are going to host. They'll be looking at what infrastructure is required, what infrastructure do we already have. They'll be asked about things like the vision of the tournament. They'll be asked about things like legacy. They'll be asked about who's going to fund it. They'll be asked about what's the interest in hosting the event from the local public. They'll put all of this sort of information together and then submit their final bid in April next year. And then there'll be a decision made in September 2023. In terms of what the requirements are, so there are specific stadium requirements. At the moment, the initial indications are it's 9 stadiums, minimum of 9 stadiums are needed of various capacities, of which we have here in the UK and Ireland anyway from our regular sporting use. there are minimum requirements in terms of the number of hotel rooms, for example, that are available in each city. There are then legal guarantees that UEFA asks for, reduction in taxes, for example, make it easy in terms of immigration for fans to be able to get into the country. And then there's a vote that's done by the UEFA Executive Committee in 2024, and they'll be looking at all of this. There'll have been an assessment that takes place prior to then by UEFA. They'll visit each country, they'll look at the stadiums, they'll look at the plans. They will effectively run a risk evaluation on each bidder, and they will put forward which bidder they think is the most suitable. They'll look at factors like risk. They'll look at, have these countries hosted an event before? If we take a event to a new country that's never hosted such an event before, is there a risk that it might go wrong? That was clearly a risk for FIFA when they took the World Cup in 2010 to South Africa. Yeah. But obviously South Africa had hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup, and it hosted the 1996 South African Cup of Nations and the 2003 Cricket World Cup, but it wasn't on the scale of a football World Cup. So as soon as you take these sorts of events to a new country, there is increased risk. I'm sure that when they're looking at this, that the UK and Ireland bid will be relatively low risk. Turkey's bid, although they have an awful lot of the infrastructure in place already, will be slightly more risky because they haven't got quite so much experience in hosting these sorts of events. And then the vote it's a secret ballot made by individuals. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you have a secret ballot made by individuals, you don't necessarily know exactly why they vote the way they vote. I mean, we saw with the bids for the 2018 and 2022 FIFA World Cups that the only medium and high risk hosts, according to FIFA's evaluation committee, were Qatar and Russia, and they ended up being the countries who were voted to host those two World Cups, ahead of low risk countries like Australia, like England, like USA, like Spain and Portugal. So as soon as you have a secret ballot that's voted on by individuals, at the end of the day, they make the decision that they want to make, and we don't necessarily know exactly why.
Well, you sound like you're not so happy with the secret ballot. Okay, do you see UK winning this bid? Let's just put it out there.
I think that Turkey is a really interesting bid. Turkey has bid for an awful lot of events over the last 2 decades. It's bid for Olympics, 5 different Olympics. It's bid for every European Championship since 2008. I think it might have been quite close to hosting Euro 2020. The big issue with that was that they were also bidding to host the Olympic Games in 2020 as well. And I think UEFA were concerned that if Turkey hosted the Olympic Games in Istanbul and the European Championships in the same summer, that wouldn't be feasible. And so that was partly the reason why they weren't more serious bidders for 2020. So I think they've got a really, really interesting bid. They've hosted Champions League finals recently. Their government has had a big focus on sports. They've got most of the infrastructure in place already. So I think that the UK and Ireland bid would be favourites, but I think the Turkish bid is an interesting one that shouldn't be dismissed.
Okay. All right. Before I let you go, I want us to talk about you. What made you it's interesting, and you've been talking about sports, and it's obvious that this is really what you love. So what made you toe this line, especially, the business and the management sector, and how has it influenced you?
So I love sport. I've grown up in a house where sport is absolutely done. Apparently one of the first programs I ever watched on TV when I was a baby was snooker. I think because of the colours.
Okay.
But apparently when I was about 3 months old, I used to sit in front of the TV and watch snooker. So I grew up in a house where sports, football in particular, one of my earliest memories is watching Everton play on TV with my dad. My dad's an Everton fan.
Okay.
And then I've grown up loving sports. My problem was that I was never any good at it. If you'd asked me as a kid what I wanted to be, I'd have said I wanted to be a footballer. But I very, very quickly realised that was never, ever going to happen. And then I always had an interest in maths and business and finance. Okay. And I studied economics initially at university, and then decided that the area of finance and management that I was most interested in was the world of sports. It allowed me to combine what I was relatively decent at from a professional point of view with the thing that I've got an absolute passion for. And it makes it a lot easier it kind of makes it easy in some ways, because when I'm doing research, for example, and I'm looking at Olympic Games and European Championships, it's stuff that I have a natural interest in. It doesn't necessarily always feel like work. But then also sometimes I'm at a football match, I'm at a Wolves match, and I'm looking at the sponsors, and I'm not thinking like a fan. I'm thinking, well, why are they sponsoring there? Why have they got that sponsor in that position? How safe is this? What happens if we need to get everyone out of the stadium within 2 minutes? And sometimes it can make it slightly more difficult to switch off.
Interesting. So this isn't like a job, it's more of, it's easier to work with, yes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I did have fun with you today, Dr. Tom. And it's interesting to know that you're a one-man team. Like, you just like one club and that's it for life.
It's how I mentioned my dad's an Everton fan, so I follow Everton.
Okay.
Because I was brought up watching Everton. My first ever games were at Goodison Park. My dad did his best to make me support Everton. But it was Wolves were my local team growing up. They were the team that I've been going to watch since I was a child. I had a season ticket there for many, many years. They're the only team for me.
Okay, no problem. All right, thank you for joining us on the show. We did have fun learning from you.
You're very welcome.
All right, that was Dr. Tom Bason from Coventry University's Research Center for Business and Society. Stay tuned for more.